Okay, good evening, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm certain we'll have some more people joining us in the next few minutes, but I recognize everyone's time is precious, although it has started to rain here in Northwest Ohio, so this is a nice way for me to spend a rainy evening. Not sure if it's raining where you are. We're happy to welcome you tonight, and hopefully you've been able to take advantage of some of the other virtual lectures that we've had this spring. My name is Sarah Sisser. I'm the Executive Director of the Hancock Historical Museum in Findlay, Ohio. And I also serve as a member of the board of Friends of Ohio Barns, and we like to call that FOB. If this is the first time you're hearing about FOB, welcome. We're happy to have you joining us. I know I see many familiar faces as I have throughout this virtual lecture process, so it's good to see all of you as well. Friends of Ohio Barns was founded in order to raise awareness about and to educate the public about Ohio's wonderful historic barns, and we do that in several different ways. One of the ways that we do that is with a wonderful annual conference that has traveled for over 20 years to a different county, a different part of the state. Unfortunately, this is the second year in a row that we've been unable to have our annual conference because of the pandemic. And so as a board, we decided we'd try a different avenue to help to educate the public and reach out to our membership. And we're doing that with a virtual lecture series. And tonight is the fourth and final iteration of that lecture series. And we've been really thankful to all of you for attending and to our guest speakers throughout that process. So thanks for being here. If you, again, are sort of unfamiliar with Friends of Ohio Barns, we would love to have you learn more by visiting our website at friendsofohiobarns.org. And if you're so inclined, we'd love to have you as a member to help support some of the initiatives that we have going on. So please consider that. Just a few points of housekeeping this evening. We would like for you to keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. If you're not too familiar with Zoom, you should have been muted when you came in, but you can mute and unmute yourself with the mute icon in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Also, when it's time for question and answer period at the end of the lecture, we ask that you use the chat function to ask your questions, and you can do that with the chat icon that is towards the center of the bottom of your screen. So I will be happy to facilitate the question and answer after our speaker has presented this evening. Finally, just so you all are aware, we are recording tonight's presentation, and you will be able to view that lecture as well as the other lectures that we've had this spring via YouTube, and you can find the links on our website, again, friendsofohiobarns.org. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Steve Gordon. Steve holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in history from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Since 1976, Steve has worked for the Miami Purchase Association for Historic Preservation, the Kentucky Heritage Council, the State Historic Preservation Office of the Ohio Historical Society, where he oversaw the Ohio Historic Inventory and National Register of Historic Places programs. And most recently, he's worked for the McGuffey House and Museum at Miami University, the Three Valley Conservation Trust, and Metro Parks of Butler County. A native of Ohio, Steve's research interests include local and regional architecture, cultural landscapes, craft and building technology, especially vernacular buildings and barns, and the study of regional material culture. His publications include How to Complete the Ohio Historic Inventory, as well as articles on the U.S. Grant birthplace, 19th century prefabricated housing, women architects in Ohio, Cincinnati's meatpacking industry, maple sugar production in Southwest Ohio, farmland conservation, and Spring Grove Cemetery. Steve has written and co-authored over 50 nominations to the National Register of Historic Places. Won't you please help me to welcome Steve Gordon?
Thank you very much, Sarah. It is a real pleasure and a privilege to speak with all of you this evening. Let me get going here on the slideshow. All right. I am humbled to have been given the vast experience and knowledge of the Friends of Ohio Board and many of its members. One of the many benefits of being a member of FOB is the learning opportunity, especially at conferences. I am continually amazed at the passion, devotion, and time FOB gives to the documentation and awareness awareness building of Ohio's barns. So as Sarah said, like most of you, we are eager. No, actually, we are hungry for getting together at our next annual conference. Mike Wengler and I cannot wait until this time next year when all of you come to Preble County. Now, I have about 40 slides to share with you this evening, and I'd just like to preface the slides with a few comments. There are some wonderful search engines out there that I have used, and I think many of you have used. I saw David Simmons as a guest this evening, who, David, hello, and I really owe a lot to David Simmons because he was my mentor when I first started at the Ohio Historical Society. And if you haven't seen any of David's videos on bridges in Ohio, they're really impressive. So well done, David. But what I was going to say is the search engines that if you go to your local university, you might be able to go to the library and find in the American Periodical series, you may have access to several agricultural journals and publications such as the Ohio Farmer, the American Agriculturist, the Southern Planter, Ohio Cultivator, DeBow's Review. There's many out there that you can use, and they use ProQuest, so you might be able to do some searching under a specific word such as barn or barns, and you can bracket by periods of time. So there are many great search engines. Now, one of the areas that is not indexed at all, at least not that I have found in most cases, except during the 1930s under the WPA program, most of your newspaper articles are not readily indexed. So you have to more or less in your community search through there and find where the agricultural press would have covered various happenings and news of farms in your county or in your area. So you have to be a detective, not surprisingly. I think most of you are probably interested in history, local history, and have done genealogy. So you really have to turn over almost every stone when you're looking at a particular subject. So I just wanted to preface that with that comment that what I'm going to share with you, I've gleaned really from about the past, I would say 25, 30 years, bits and pieces. Some I found recently. And I think like most of you, there's a long to-do list. We all have that. Yeah, I want to do that. I want to go see those barns down in Highland County. I want to get over to those barns in Columbiana County, that farm. But you know, life gets in the way and work gets in the way. So there's a lot I'm going to miss tonight. So bear with me. This is a big state. It's a rich state. I think Ohio, it's safe to say that we probably are in the top 4 states in the country in the diversity and number of our pre-1900 barns. So we have inherited a real treasure trove of material culture from our ancestors. And I think one of the things that FOB does a great job of is trying to alert people about these are rare resources. They're never going to be built again like this. They're oftentimes, I love Rudy when he always says, you know, it's the straw shed or the straw barn that collapses before the older timber frame barn. I've always remembered that from Rudy's presentations. So, and it's great to see Rudy and Laura. So let me go into the slides now. Now, most of you who've done local research always come into the, you read in the first chapter of your county history or in your communities, the articles that writers and observers were putting in these publications. They were fascinated by the abundance and the fertility of Ohio and what they call the West. And a lot of these scenes were portrayed and romanticized by artists. Here we have one of my favorite paintings. I'm an unapologetic lover of 19th century Hudson River School and landscapes. My modernist friends kind of poke fun at me and say, oh, you're living in the past. And I said, yeah, but I get to live 2 lives. I live the present and the past. So that's the beauty of it. Well, but these writers and these artists were fascinated by the transformation from what they call the wilderness, which we kind of know now is really is not that accurate, because there was a large population of Native Americans, and we know from studies that the Native Americans were actually managing several portions of the landscape, particularly here in the Midwest. A great deal has been written about the taming of the land, as it's often called. One of the things I frequently, wonder about, and I pause and think, especially this time of year, is what it sounded like in 1850. You go out now and you hear jet planes overhead, you may hear a siren or a train in the distance. But think about 1850. Yes, you had trains, but certainly not the number we have now. No internal combustion engines to speak of. But what you had maybe was the singing of the plow, the sounds of the barnyard, maybe the heavy breathing and movement of the draft horses, with all their tack. And of course, for me, I'm a bird lover, and I think about how many species and the number of birds we must have heard at that time of year during the migration season. So I'm very much in tune with the natural landscape. As Sarah said, I work part-time for a local land trust. We're doing a lot to try to conserve farmland preservation. I think there is a large movement in this country of people that are very attuned to that, and they're concerned about some of the rapid changes. There are numerous accounts that we come across in the agricultural press about the land and the fertility. One of my favorite quotes here is from the Ohio Cultivator at the top of the slide. The writer said, "The homestead stock barn is the pride of the farm. Here is his bank," and he did put it in caps. "Here is his bank, his treasury, his factory, his laboratory, the headquarters of his outdoor life." Ohio Cultivator, 1857. Moritz Bush travels in North America. I believe it was 1852. I didn't put the date on there, but he was traveling north from Dayton to the Dunkard community in Preble County in northwest Montgomery County. And he wrote, "Great red barns behind elegant dwellings demonstrate the prosperity of those whose lucky star led them to build in this region." So there's always that optimism, and there's that sense of fertility, and the future looks very bright for most of these farmers because they know that they've got good land. Those that didn't get good land were probably heading out, maybe on the Oregon Trail in 1844, 1845, because they couldn't get the good land. We have a little account here in the Ohio Cultivator in 1848. Notes of a field trip north. This was an excursion from Cleveland to Painesville. As you know, Painesville up in Lake County, right, hugging the shoreline of Lake Erie. The writer noted there were substantial and tasteful dwellings. And tasteful is a word that you frequently see in the agricultural press. Tasteful architecture, tasteful dwellings. And capacious barns almost everywhere visible are evidences of substantial wealth and prosperity among the farmers. So this is 1848. This really, I think, counters those who think that Ohio was a real backwater in the 19th century. People were living in primitive log houses or shanty buildings out in the middle of the woods. No, actually, by 1850, Ohio was really, it was like I know Silicon Valley is the right metaphor to use, but it was the place to be. And the Wright brothers noticed. I think one of their great quotes is they said, "We had the good fortune of having great parents and being born in Ohio." When people asked about what do they attribute their genius and their success in life to, good parents and being born in Ohio, the Wright brothers. Now, not everybody was totally impressed with the architecture of these barns and farms. Ross County, Ohio, as you know, is quite different than obviously Lake County and areas north of what would become the National Road. In the Ohio Cultivator in 1850, the writer said, "Good barns are very unpopular in this section. Those who have had what they call barns generally keep enough cows, colts, and other stock around them to keep their yards a mere mud hole." Or in 1859, another writer said, "In traveling about Ohio, we have often been compelled to notice the want of sufficient and well-arranged farm buildings." So not surprisingly, we have people who have different opinions on what they're seeing out of the landscape. We had another one in 1865. It was in the Utica Herald in Licking County. The writer said the style of barns has changed materially within the past 5 years. He was writing in 1865. There is less disposition to huddle together a lot of small buildings to meet the necessities of the farm, but rather to have stables, mouths, etc., under one roof. One of the things I recall from my work at the Ohio Historical Society and doing research is the period from 1865, at the end of the Civil War, to 1873, when we had what was called the Panic of 1873, which was also called the Jay Gould crisis. Ohio was growing by leaps and bounds. When you drive through many Ohio towns, you will notice an abundance of Italianate architecture. And much of this Italianate architecture was being built during that time period. You know, really, the Civil War was generally a pretty prosperous time for Ohio. Now, I don't want to discount all of the young men that were killed in the war, injured, but the demand for armament and war material and agricultural products from Ohio during the war really helped this state leap into that, what I would call the halcyon period from 65 to 73. Then, of course, we had the panic and it picked right back up again. So that's an important period in Ohio history. Now, this is a little bit of a refresher for many of you. This isn't going to surprise you, but I think it's worth telling that in 1880, Ohio was ranked #1 in the nation in the value of its farms. Now, this included the land, fences, and buildings. And this comes from the federal population census. Now, improved land in farms, that is largely based on acreage. And if you've done much research on agriculture during this period, especially by the 1850s, you see, in fact, many Ohio farmers were buying land in Illinois and Iowa. They had other farms out there. In fact, the Champaign-Urbana area, I do believe that Urbana, Illinois was probably named after Urbana, Ohio, because that area around there were many Ohio farmers that owned large acreages there. And they would fatten their hogs and their cattle on the corn being grown in that prairie, that wonderful prairie soil of Illinois. But here you see Stark County in 1880. Think about it, 4,000 farms. And it's $26 million, almost $27 million that time period. You see Stark and Wayne, and this is certainly no surprise to many of you, particularly Laura and Rudy, who live right up in that area. Now, Hamilton and Franklin obviously is a little distorted because they're more urban, smaller farms, but still pretty prosperous and high value of the land. I think that was part of it too. But then you see Paulding down there. It hadn't been settled much yet because of the Great Black Swamp. They hadn't really developed it much with the tiling system. But no, it wasn't soon after this, though, that they discovered they had great soil up there in Paulding County. They have some wonderful barns. Excuse me. Let's see. Number of farms between 100 and 500 acres. Again, this comes from the agricultural census of 1880. You see Licking had the most farms of that size in the entire state, but all those counties that I have listed there also have a very significant number of pre-1900 barns. Very rich in terms of their material culture. And this is seen here in this wonderful sketch of Yoder Farm up in Stark County from 1885. I think I have 1882. It should be 1885 there at the bottom of it with the snake rail fence. Some of these are a little bit fanciful when you look at them because the farmer is obviously trying to convey the prosperity of the farm and how beautifully tended and manicured it is. But I think you get a sense of the prosperity of this particular farm. And there's the barn today. And the wonderful T-plan brick farmhouse with a little bit of Italianate, maybe some a little bit of emerging Queen Anne elements on it. Really a marvelous, I'd love to have this over my fireplace, that particular sketch. Just beautiful. I love it. So what about foreign-born population? I just put together a few statistics, and what's good about going to the census is you have this information before you do your field work, and you start thinking, well, if you find barns that have some idiosyncratic diagnostic features that you're kind of scratching your head on, you might look at some of these foreign-born influences in these particular counties. And you look at Auglaize, the concentration of settlers in 1872 from Switzerland, Tuscaroras, and then you look at those counties, obviously with German, which many of these counties had a large German population. Then you got the Welsh and the English influence in some counties. So again, I just showed these slides because I think there's some usefulness in looking through the census records. And then if you go to the manuscript census through ancestry.com, that's also, we could give a whole talk about that. And I think that might be something to do in the future. But again, here is a typical description taken from our county history. Preble is just north of here. The western part of the county borders Indiana. This is the Chrisman Farm, which is immediately west-northwest of Eaton, Ohio, the county seat. The farm looks very much as it does in this 1875 county atlas image. The family still owns it. It's still in the family. It's a century farm. It talks about here, large quantities of hay are grown and the huge barns, which are everywhere, dot the landscape, attest the success attending the labors of the husbandman. Indeed, these barns far surpass the dwelling houses in their grand proportions. These immense structures often exhibit as many as 5 or 6 tiers of windows. So that's a fairly typical account that you will find in your county histories. Now, one of the areas that I am not that expert in, I have to confess that many of you are, is, actually finding the wood, the timber in the woods or the wood lot and getting the wood out, and then obviously getting it ready for doing the hewing of the logs. One of the things I've discovered in going through several of the journals is, not surprisingly again, there is not a consensus about when is the best time to cut the trees. You would think this would have been sheer science and everybody would have been on the same page, but no. We have this farmer in 1876 that was saying that basically the spring is the time to cut. That's when to do it. Other farmers say, no, that's not the time to do it. Here's one account I'll read to you that I came across from, this one would have been the same 1859 one you see at the bottom, useful information about timber that appeared in the Ohio Farmer. It said, oak and chestnut should never be cut before they attain 100 years and spruce and pine 70 years. Logs should be naked and laid upon scantlings above the ground. Logs should not be exposed to the hot sun and drying, as they are liable to split. Care should be given not to dry timber too rapidly, as it is liable to crack by the rapid expansion of moisture. So there's a lot of different opinions on when you harvest the trees, how you get the trees ready, how you cure the wood. And I'm sure that Rudy and Dan and Rick Beck and many others could talk quite at length about that particular subject. What about the cost of barns? I've always been intrigued by that. And again, a lot of it comes down to common sense. The American Agriculturalist reported in 1847, what is the cost of a barn? Well, it depends on the expense of the materials, the price of labor, and the amount of work done by hauling, quarrying stone, hewing timber, etc. Again, that's pretty much common sense. That's pretty true to this day. Now, here is an interesting itemization of a barn over just west of Oxford in Franklin County. I have yet to go try and find this barn, but it was built in 1845 by George Heron's father. And he listed from the account book of his father that this is a very large barn. It had 7 vents in it, and it was a transverse plan. It was a little bit different. It was, again, a little bit of an odd one. But he wrote the father wrote in there that the stonemasons, 22 days work and boarding, that when I say boarding, that meant that they were putting them up probably in a farmhouse or maybe a boarder's room upstairs in the house. We had one in the farmhouse that I grew up in. There was a small room upstairs that my mom said was basically a tenant, not a tenant farm, but a farm labor. It was built for. Our house was built in 1857. 45,000 shingles, $100. And you see the strap hinges, which we see on so many barns. Now, what's interesting here, you see wrought nails, $2, but then down below, I think I had on there, I saw some other in there for nails and spikes, $26.55. So I wasn't sure exactly how those nails differed from the wrought nails, unless they were just a larger nail. And by this time in 1840s, I know that the famous company over in Weirton, West Virginia and Bel Air area, they were making cut nails. So they were starting to be pretty available by this time. And then you see some of the breakdown on the sawing. It mentions sawing logs. It did not mention hewing at all, but the account book said sawing. So I don't know if that was interchangeable, the use of hewing and sawing. I doubt it, but that's what was there. Now, Waldo Brown is a really interesting agriculturist. He just lived about a mile north of where I'm speaking from now. The house is still standing. It's a wonderful kind of a little Gothic revival cottage. It sits on a high elevation with a commanding view of the valley to the east. He was a prominent writer for the Ohio Farmer. For many years, he was a lecturer for the farm institutes. And according to his obituary, he lectured in almost every town in Ohio. He did this for 4 decades. And the obituary said his breezy and brainy letters to newspapers fell under the pen name of Johnny Plowboy. And when writing for the Ohio Farmer, his tagline was Waldo. He has in our special collections library here at Miami has his diary, about a 24-year period. And entry in 1858 mentions that carpenters began work on his barn. And by August 10th, it was raised. We don't know how large the barn was. He doesn't have much detail on it, but he just talks a little bit. In 1885, he decided to remove the barn and build a new one. But basically what you're seeing here is from June 11th until roughly July 8th, the barn was pretty much ready and he was able to get in 4 loads of hay. Now, why he was painting the barn in December, I'm not sure. It would seem awfully cold to me. And I don't know, maybe it was because that time the wood siding had cured enough. I just find December not my optimum time to do painting, but maybe it was warm. I don't know. So if you run into these puzzlers that when you look at the research. All right, let's see here. We have the Lorain County barns, and we have, as many of you know, that probably the 3 predominant barn types in Ohio prior to 1900, and I'm probably oversimplifying, I tend to do, it would be the ground barn, the 3-bay Yankee barn, the New England barn, where you have it's smaller in scale, it doesn't have a basement, typically has a threshing floor, and then you have a mow on one side and maybe a granary and equipment storage on the other. Sometimes you'll have a small stable in there, but typically not. And these barns are very common in New York State. This is the predominant barn throughout much of New York State, the 3-bay, what some people call the threshing barn. The next one, of course, would be lumping it together, the bank barn with either a Pennsylvania bank barn, a Schweitzer barn. It can have the cantilever, it may not have the cantilever. And then the third one, of course, would be what I call the raised basement barn, where you have a raised ramp on one side and the other side. Tends to come a little bit later, not always, but they tend to be a little bit later. But this is an interesting observation from Lorain County in 1867, where the author says the barns in Lorain County are not the imposing structures to be found in some of the counties to the south of us. If our German and Yankee populations could learn from each other, the gain might be mutual. Yankee barns might be improved as much as the houses of some of our Teutonic neighbors. Always a little bit of little humor, of course, and sometimes there's cattiness, which you'll see coming up in a few of the slides. It can be fairly cutting. Some of the, let's not just think that Facebook and Twitter, that people have really gotten rude. I mean, there's some pretty, how should I put it, interesting writers and comments that are expressed in the agricultural press. People didn't hold back on some of these. Now here, again, is that classic 3-bay barn, and it's described as such in the American Agriculturalist of 1884. You can see very easily how this barn in Montgomery County, which that barn is used for air-cured tobacco, at least at that time when the photo was taken, almost matches up perfectly and probably to the dimensions of the profile above. I also, let's see, in here, I have a little thing on fences, because if you look in the upper right of this historical photograph up here, you can see the Virginia snake rail fence there. This is 1898, this photo. So you can see these fences tended to last a long time. But you look at Lorain County in 1867, the account said that most fences in Lorain County are old Virginia style rail fences. Osage orange hedges have been there for about 15 to 16 years. So we're saying maybe about 1850, the Osage orange or hedge apple tree came to Lorain County. Now I do know in Hamilton County, Spring Grove Cemetery imported in 1845 some Osage orange trees from Arkansas, basically for fencing to keep the hogs out of the cemetery. And amazingly, some of those trees still survive. They live a long time. And as many of you know, they're almost impossible to cut with a chainsaw, let alone split. You might as well give up. The other account, another one here, said that chestnut rails are the best posts to set on flat stones. Of course, I don't think in Western Ohio there was much chestnut. I think that must have been mostly the eastern and southeastern part of the state. I think our soils where I am are too alkaline for chestnut. It tends to like a little more acid. Again, cut the fence timber in the winter. Some farmers prefer late summer, and white oak or cedar posts, as we know, are certainly the most preferable. Again, here's another elevation. This is a raised basement 3-bay barn. This particular image comes out of 1870, the American Agriculturist. I don't know how big the circulation of these farm journals and publications were. I tend to think that they weren't that widespread, the actual dissemination of these. But having said that, there probably were a lot of farmers that did subscribe and maybe shared it or said, hey, I read this great article in American Agriculturist about this barn plan that we might want to try or we want to build. So there's another example of it coming out of the agricultural press. Now, technology is always changing agriculture. It's happening today. One of the things that, and I'm working at the Land Trust, is we're seeing in Ohio and Indiana, a lot of farmers are being approached by solar array companies. And in some areas I have seen, I don't know if Sarah, you've seen it up in Hancock County, but there have been a lot of opposition. And there's been a lot of consternation about what's going to happen to the land when a lot of these big solar arrays come in. I know there's a massive one in, I believe it's in Brown County, east of Cincinnati, that is several hundred acres that's going to be under solar arrays. So that's just an example of how the technology is going to change the landscape and probably agriculture. Well, one of the things that many of us wonder is, when did the hay track come in, or at least when did the mechanization, or how mechanization isn't the right word, but horsepower of moving hay into the barn come about? And a lot of it was, we start seeing it as early as the 1840s, late 1840s, and by 1850s, there were a lot of people that were promoting the advantage of the hay fork getting into the barns. And this barn, you may hopefully see a year from now in Preble County, the Schaefer barn, you know, it probably well did use some of these rope and block and tackle for moving the hay up into the hay mound. Because remember, that baled hay is a 20th century phenomenon. All the hay in the 19th century was loose hay. And I can't imagine how many bad backs these farmers had moving all that hay around, let alone all the other things they were doing. My gosh, unbelievable. And here you see a couple of examples by mid-century, or the third quarter of the 19th century. You really start seeing almost every farm is starting to utilize, and there's massive amounts of hay being stored in these barns. No wonder why Northeast Ohio and many of these areas have such massive hay barns, because by this time you could really store a lot of hay in these barns, and you can increase your dairy herd significantly by doing that. And of course, the barns get bigger, not surprisingly. What about barn doors? I was a bit surprised that the doors that are basically on tracks, sliding doors, some of them go back to the 1850s, at least mention of them. Large doors hung on iron pulleys running on an iron railway were far preferable to wood or being hung with hinges. This is Harrison County, Ohio, in 1855. Who would have thought? I would have thought late 19th century, but no, it was happening before that. Here's 1850, again, our friend George Herron over in Indiana talking about large doors set on pulleys. Well, Ohio really was the center of agricultural technology too. We had a massive amount of agricultural implement industry in Springfield and Canton, Ohio, centers, major production. And then you had cities like Cincinnati had a massive hardware in iron foundries in Cincinnati. They were pumping out this stuff, and it took off during the Civil War, but it really started in the 1840s. So, the Industrial Revolution went hand in glove with the rise of agriculture in Ohio. And Ohio, you're probably getting tired of me saying it, but Ohio was the place to be if you were, an industrialist or a farmer during the last 3 quarters of the 19th century. It was just an amazing place to study. Well, then we have this little countdown here, and we're starting to get into now this conversation that farmers had about the different types of barns. And here we have in 1894, a Seneca County farmer said, there is not in any of them the old-fashioned overshoot, almost universally prevailing in the old Pennsylvania style. Instead of stone walls being the cause of so much evil as our friends imagine, they furnish the very best means to keep out the water, which our deluded friends imagine is conducted in by the walls. So there is one of the big trends and topics in the agricultural press, not surprisingly again, is the pros and cons of banking your ramp side wall of the barn. This is a perennial conversation in the agricultural press. Okay, I don't think I went too far. Let me check here real quick. All right, got down. All right. All right, here's some, you can read through some of these, are interesting commentary about what some people just call loosely the Pennsylvania barn. And an early one, 1838, a writer from New Philly, Ohio said, an exception to the poor sheds mentioned above are the barns erected in recent years by the Swiss settlers. And when he says Swiss, I have a feeling you're probably looking at people that are more coming from Germany, maybe moving in from the Shenandoah Valley or Pennsylvania to Ohio. These roomy, serviceable structures are popular amongst the Americans and generally termed Swiss barns. Now, here's one that Rudy and Laura probably recognize quite well. This one here, up in Carroll County, it's got a stone house that has a date stone over the front door dated 1839. And it was built by a gentleman named Hewitt, the farmer. And then it's now owned by the Spees family. But the photos on the left were taken in about 1985. And then Rudy did this nice schematic sketch, I believe about 1990. And if I remember correctly, Rudy, you oversaw and did a lot of the renovation work on this particular barn, which is really a remarkable structure here in Ohio. All right, here is one of my favorite images from right in the center of that growth period in Ohio, 1870. This is from a national publication called the Manufacturer and Builder. And every now and then you'll just find one article in a journal that they just cover, because this isn't typically something they would feature, would be an article about a barn in this particular journal, but they did. And this is kind of the quintessential barn from the third quarter of the 19th century. There are probably thousands of barns like this across the state. This formula was repeated time and time again. You see it all the way from Southwest Ohio. You don't see it as much in Southeast, because obviously the Appalachian influence is quite different and the terrain is different. But for good 3/4 of the state, this is really a mainstream example of this barn here. This barn you're looking at, what I found interesting is the text described what some people might call the overshoot or overshot. They call it the overget. I'd never seen that word before. At first I thought it was a typo, but it was used 3 or 4 times in the article. The barn is 40 feet by 70 with a 6-foot overget. The provision is made for light and ventilation in the windows at the sides and front and back, all of which are arranged with rolling blinds, which I didn't know they had rolling blinds. There are 2 threshing floors, 2 A's you can see in the main floor plan. The mouths are BB, they're 17 feet in width. The C area there you see are the 4 bins for grain. And the D, though, the light lower right hand, is a trapdoor at the overget, where the wagon below can be loaded with great ease, according to the article. The funnels for conveying the hay are at E. You'll see at the top of the main floor plan, those 2E. And we will see a very nice hay funnel in one of the barns in Preble County next year. The hay funnel extend up to the tie beam, the very top of the tie beam, so that the hay can be placed in them when the hay mow is full. That's a pretty interesting little feature of the barn that I didn't know much about until fairly recently. There are not a lot of those surviving out there. And what about the location of barns? I have more research on this. I didn't put in here, but not surprisingly, this one said, level ground. Well, a lot of places in Ohio, you can't find good level ground, but you do want a spacious yard for cattle and manure on the south and east sides. And over again, I'm impressed with your farmers just had so much practical knowledge that was passed down generation from generation. They were so attuned to the weather, to the wind patterns, drainage, where the good water was and where the bad water was. They just really knew, most of them. And so they knew, if they're going to be threshing grain in the barn, or they want their livestock to be warm in the morning sun. We know all this, but it's a lot of people today have forgotten this, so I'm afraid. Here's a little account about the 2-story barn plan, which there were pros and cons, and you'll see it here in a little bit. The debate back and forth. Now this one from Troy, Ohio. This is interesting because I've been intrigued by those barn builders that have a ramp or bridge between I should say a bridge that connects the ramp, the earthen ramp, to the threshing floor of the barn, which would be the upper side of a bank barn. A lot of barns will have a open space between the foundation and the ramp, where you can pull a wagon in there, and then you can load the wagon easily, and you don't have the static pressure as much from the earth pushing in on the wall. This particular barn at the bottom this is one of those I want to get back to. I haven't been back there in 30 years. There's a cluster of these barns that were built by Washington Blackburn, who was from Chester County. He built this barn in 1851. There's a group of Quakers, Society of Friends settlements in this area. And this particular family, Benjamin and Eliza Kennard, came to Penn Township in 1850 from Chester County, Pennsylvania. And Benjamin Kennard wrote to his uncle Jesse shortly after purchasing the farm. He said to him, or he wrote to him, "Rouse up some of my brothers. Come out here and see what a country they have made here, where 50 years ago there was nothing but a howling wilderness. Now it is laid off in fertile farms." JAS, Canton, Ohio, 1886. My advice is to use corner posts not less than 28 feet long above your stable walls, although your barn builders may tell you it cannot be done. But I have done it on a farm near Strasburg, Tuscarawas County. Such a barn will hold 1/3 more that if built with 18 or 20-foot posts and will not cost 1/10 more. Now here we have a little interesting commentary about the bank barns. Well, M.E. King had written a rather scathing article condemning the bank barn in 1884 in the Ohio Farmer. He claimed that 99 of 100 are damp and wet and the stock shivering. Well, this Frank Graham said, if he will visit my farm, I will show him a bank barn with 18-inch wall, 9 feet high. He will not find any of my stock shivering. Here we go, some of the bank barn conversations. Here's one in Pigeon Run. I haven't looked to see where Pigeon Run is, but I'm guessing it's near Stark County. I doubt very much if one farmer out of 100 in Stark County would disapprove of bank barns. And Stark County has good experienced farmers, if any county in Ohio has them. And then down here, I love this Mr. Brainerd in Windfall, Ohio. It's a new town. I never heard of Windfall. Maybe David Simmons knows where it is. But any distinction between bank and basement barns is superfluous. Do not call houses basement houses. A bank barn is in effect 2 barns in one. The one used entirely for stabling while the other is for feed of all kinds, but with the added convenience of being under one roof and the feed thrown down just where it is wanted. Kind of summed it up, I think. More in 1881. This is one in Fulton County in Northwest Ohio. This is a pretty early barn for Fulton County. This one was built in 1878 on level ground, stone foundation, lower story, 9 feet high. That seems to be kind of the preferred height for your basement. Upper story, 18 feet to the plate, so it's a little shallower. The second story is 6 feet wider than the lower story, therefore forming a projection or shed on the side next to the barnyards. Again, there's so much terminology about the cantilever, or the overshot, or overshoot, or overget. Again, whatever you want to call it. One of my favorite barns is up in Montgomery County in Perry Township. And it was built in 1852. And this was from a farm journal in 1884, where they hosted the Farmers Club, enjoyed dinner for an hour, then assembled at the barn where the grain floor had been cleaned and seats arranged for the business meeting. The mouths on each side were filled with flax, oats, wheat, fragrant timothy, and clover. And with the barn doors thrown open, the air was delightfully fresh and warm. I wonder, is there any flax being grown anywhere in Ohio? I don't think I would know a flax plant if I saw one. I'd love to see it because the seed is just beautiful. Here's an example of the interior of this picture. I shared this with the Friends of Ohio Barns at a meeting up in Worcester back in 2008, I think it was. And then it has a marvelous tobacco barn. I thought I had a thing in there on tobacco. I guess I didn't. Must have forgotten to put that in, but there was a real interesting comment about use of tobacco in the 19th century. I'm sorry, I didn't put that in. There's that tobacco house, and you get over into Monroe County and southern Belmont County, you still see a few of these tobacco houses over there, which are unhewn logs. They're rapidly disappearing, though, sadly. Another word that comes up quite a bit in the agricultural press is, I guess instead of using scantling, not scantling, but lumber, they call it stuff. Quite often there's stuff. And of course, this is a signature barn along I-75 up in Wood County. I sure hope it's still there. It's just an incredible barn when you see it off west of I-75 traveling 1896. It's just a marvelous structure. And this, I love this scene that I got in a Christmas card several years ago from Geauga County, the Geauga County farmstead. Now, this particular one here, Model Dairy Farm, this is W.I. Chamberlain, was a fairly important correspondent with the Ohio Farmer in the late 19th century. And he wrote in the Farmers Institute, before we had the Agricultural Extension Act, was that 1914, where you had a lot of the circulars and periodicals being put out by the agricultural colleges, that you had what were called these Farmers Institutes, where a lot of the minutes and proceedings and papers given at these Farmers Institutes were published, and they are a treasure trove of information. And W.I. Chamberlain wrote, I'll share with you this little observation he had. I thought him quite amusing. He said, "I am well aware that what would be a model barn for one man and one farm might not at all be some for another. I would no more to attempt to plan a barn for another man without knowing all of his circumstances and wants than I would attempt to pick out a wife for him. I would get into trouble in both cases." By the very late 19th century, in the early 20th century, you're starting to see obviously the slow disappearance of the heavy timber frame barn, but you still see a timber frame here in the Radford Plan Book of 1908, which this did have a large circulation. This was Radford was out of Chicago, and they did house plans, and these were not ready-made like your Sears. These were merely the plans. You did not buy the materials from the Radford Company. These just provided the plans. And here we have sheep barns. I haven't done a lot of work on sheep barns. There's a whole other topic that I need to look into. But here's another barn that I want to try to find over in Greene County. Maybe Governor DeWine knows that this barn is still standing. So incidentally, I mentioned the governor, and for those of you who don't know, his home place is the Whitelaw Reed property, a magnificent architectural style house over in Greene County, not far from Cedarville. And there is a barn there that I want to go to. So someday I might try to see if I can go visit him, because maybe when he's out of office, if he ever retires, I think he's going to work probably till he's 95, but go for it. I think he's done a great job. All right, this is the Herrick barn. This is up in Wellington, which I just love that area. Lorain County and Wellington and Oberlin, they're two of my favorite places in Ohio. I just love it up there. There's something about it. But this was featured in the Ohio Farmer in 1892, and it was a first prize dairy barn. The barn was 60 by 105 feet. Basement floors were Portland cement. This is 1892, a Portland cement foundation. All of the heavy timber was 8 by 10. The hay track ran, you can see in the end view of the frame here at the very top, the hay track extended all the way from gable end to gable end. Let's see, the lumber cost was $700. The carpentry was $700. The foundation, 100,000 bricks. You can see some of the bricks there in the elevation drawing. And the steel roof, so you have a standing seam steel roof, $375, hardware $225. So the total cost in 1892 for this barn was $3,000. And that's a big structure. Now, I have not tried to figure out how the 3,000 would be calculated in today's costs. But with the way lumber is going right now, that 3,000 sounds pretty reasonable to me. Then we have the rural architecture here. This is what's happening in again, Ohio. John Shaver, plank frame barn construction. He was one of the giants of the dimension lumber framing of barns, shifting away from the heavy frame, the heavy timber, to more of the lighter frame. And he was in the Bell Fountain area. And a lot's been written about John Shaver. This man was truly significant in agricultural engineering during that time period. And we see a Joseph Wing from Champaign County. His farm is still intact. It's another one I want to go to. I've driven by it. There were three guys. There was Hickox from, I think he was from Belmont County. John Shaver and Joseph Wing were kind of the triumvirate of barn engineering right about this time period. And there was a lot in the Ohio Farmer featuring their various interior designs. I'm going to go very quickly now because I'm getting down to about the last 5 minutes here. I shared this at a previous barn conference. This is kind of an idiosyncratic, one-of-a-kind barn over here in Butler County. It's very lovingly maintained by the owner, who is a direct descendant of the farmer that bought the property in 1803. So this is soon to be a bicentennial barn. Well, it's actually more than a bicentennial barn, am I thinking? See, I live in the past. I can't keep track of the years. But it's truly a remarkable structure. And I'm going to share two slides because ever since I was a little kid, I've always loved silos. We had a silo, wasn't much of a silo, it was a concrete Marietta silo made in 1950 on the farm that my parents bought in 1951. But I just loved the silos and the transition from the square to the round ones. And it reminds me of the wonderful quote that Hubert G.H. Wilhelm gave at a lecture. It probably was for Friends of Ohio Barns, but it might have been for another event. When people asked him, so why did they go from the square silo to the round silo? And he said in his wonderful voice, he said, well, they learned just like you can't make good kraut in a square kraut. It's just, you got to have a round silo. So I'll never forget that. So this is my final slide, taken by a really good friend of mine here locally, of a barn on his neighbor's property. And I'm going to end with this rather amusing little story from the Ohio Farmer in 1859. The title of the article was Jones and Johnson, a sketch for farmers. And here's the story. William Johnson and Edwin Jones are two farmers. Johnson has tidy buildings. Jones was more farmer shiftless. Jones asked to borrow an auger from Farmer Johnson. Johnson was frugal and makes a profit. Jones is sloppy and disorganized. Johnson gave a lecture to his friend. He said, the first year I began on a farm, I used to keep spirits by me, took drink for strength. I finally decided to quit and set aside my grog money. Time passed on, my grog and tobacco money kept coming in. It was now a hammer, then a saw, then a new auger, and another plane, till I now have an excellent stock of tools. I believe, friend Jones, that in giving up my grog and tobacco, I have been a great gainer. Well, the next day, Jones went into town, and instead of refilling the brown jug and empty box, he brought home a new auger. He had the ability to fix his own buildings, tighten his barn. His cows do not break through the barn floor, and they give more milk. He has stopped borrowing tools and is now, quote, a happy, thriving, and contented farmer. So on that note, I want to thank Friends of Ohio Barns and Sarah. Keep up the good work, and I look forward to seeing all of you face-to-face as a group next spring and maybe individually before then. Thank you very much, and I guess we'll take any comments, questions, criticisms.
Thanks so much, Steve. That was a wonderful presentation. Certainly reflected a great deal of research on your part. I know we all would have really enjoyed seeing the presentation in person in Preble County, but we do look forward to visiting Preble County next year for our conference. And we certainly appreciate that you were willing to share it with us via this virtual format. So if you do have any questions for Steve tonight, again, if you could please use the chat function and I can pass those along. I can field those for him. Steve, I really appreciated that one slide where you had the really detailed inventory from the barn in Franklin County, Indiana. What I wouldn't give to be able to have that kind of information for all of the barns that we've researched here in Hancock County. I've only seen that once with a ledger that detailed. And it's just priceless information to be able to know, have written out those craftsmen and the dollar amount. So that was really interesting. And then I'm going to have to get with you to talk more about that John Knight barn in Wood County. You had a beautiful picture of that. I'm pretty sure I am familiar with that barn and you wouldn't recognize it now. Unfortunately, it's in really poor condition. But that was a lovely picture of it looking sort of in its prime. There was an early question that I think you have essentially addressed, Steve, from Dave Simmons, asking if there was any way to determine circulation statistics for these periodicals. I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that anymore.
I haven't explored that too much, but it would be something worthwhile to see. I'm going to write this down, David, and see if there's anybody that might have a better angle way we could determine that. I would have to think it was pretty good because a lot of these periodicals were in business for a long time. So if they weren't selling many of these papers, there weren't many subscribers, they would have gone out of business. Now, obviously, they had advertising, which paid a lot of it. And by the way, the ads in these papers are very useful. I didn't even feature some of the ads. But the silo companies like Ross Silo in Springfield, Ohio, you just can go on and on about these companies here in Ohio had a national market. They were really significant manufacturers and fabricators of agricultural hardware, of structures, implements. It just goes on and on. And I think we kind of, because we live here, maybe we take it for granted a little bit, but it just never ceases to impress me about these smaller cities. When I say smaller, these mid-sized cities that had these wonderful industries that were thriving. Springfield was a powerhouse. Springfield and Canton were the two really centers for the ag implement business. So I'm going to write it down, David, and see if there's any way we can maybe get to that.
Steve, the only thing that occurred to me was the old, long before the digital world, they actually published union lists. Library of Congress did regular union lists of periodicals. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that you could get some idea of circulation by what libraries actually have various periodicals.
Oh, yeah.
Go up on the union list.
Yeah.
Ohio Historical Society had a great set of union lists, and then they decided they didn't need them because it's all digitized now. So they disposed of them. Obviously, they didn't ask anybody that did research. They just decided they were going to get rid of them.
Yikes.
Yeah, large bound volumes, it took up space.
Exactly. Well, nobody looks at these. Right. We don't need these.
What do we need books for?
Yeah.
Steve, another question from someone asking about, he said his all-time favorite Ohio barn has an internal silo. Have you found any word in the press about those?
Actually, yes. In fact, I did come across a plan of one. I think it was Geauga County. Most of those internal silos that I've seen documented are almost exclusively Geauga County, Lake County, that little cluster area right up in there. Of course, that was really almost exclusively your dairy area. Not that other areas weren't, but it seemed like that was really the epicenter or the hearth for these internal and square silos. I don't see square silos. Does anybody know if there's square silos anywhere in Western Ohio? If you go, I just don't, there must be, but I've not seen any.
I've seen quite a number in Wayne County. No, I'm sorry, in Medina County, quite a number. And we've actually been in one that had double internal silos that were square and then rounded out on the inside with the boarding.
Okay, well, one thing I neglected to say about the Scott barn here, I don't think I showed the floor plan. I thought I did. Oh, there it is. Well, not really. There are 3 concrete silos inside this barn. Massive, not used anymore. They've probably been used for decades. But supposedly the Portland cement used in making these silos was imported from England in the 1880s. And there's not when I last saw this barn, when I was looking at the silos, I didn't see any cracks in them. It was pretty amazing.
Steve, have you come across advertisements in the publications for the metal vents that replaced cupolas?
Oh, yes, King out of Wisconsin. The King ventilation system revolutionized the ventilation of dairy barns. That was, again, ventilation of dairy was one of those huge topics. Because as you well know, livestock create a lot of heat, especially cattle. And how do we get that heat and moisture out of barns? And so I think his name was F.W. King. I'm going to ballpark it about 1910. All of the extension circulars from the University of Wisconsin extension program talk a great deal about the King ventilation system, which would just use the way it was designed, that you would actually have in the interior. Remember, these by that time you're going mostly to what we might call, pejorative term, stick frame barns, where you would actually have a channel like a chase going up on each end of the barn, and it would funnel up into the ventilators, the King ventilators. Then you would have a lightning rod maybe up there, and you oftentimes would have a weather vane at the top of these decorative King ventilators. Yeah, they were very important, but they were not made in Ohio. They were almost exclusively made, I believe, in either Chicago or Milwaukee.
Another follow-up question talking about the internal silos, wondering if internal silos might be favored in those Northeast counties because of the snow belt.
Excellent observation. I would have to agree with that. Yeah.
Great. Steve, we also had someone inquiring about the best way to contact you. Do you have a professional email or some way that folks can get in touch with you?
Sure. I'm going to give you my personal email. This is one word.
On YouTube.
Ready? Oxford Haven, OXFORDHAVEN @gmail.com.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
Sure.
Also had a couple of questions to me personally, wondering how people can get a copy of this presentation. Or if they can get a copy. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you joined us a little bit later, this will be available on YouTube. So just like all of the lectures we've had this spring, you can get the link through our website at friendsofohiobarns.org. You can also contact us sort of collectively as a board through the website if you have any specific questions, or if we can share a recording with you. I think we could probably do that. Although I think you can download it just as easily from YouTube. Let's see, we have one more comment that came in. Henry County had a barn that the silo was in the middle of the barn.
Right. Yep.
Yeah,
that barn collapsed about 20 years ago.
Is that the, you said we called it the Chinese barn. Is that
Right. Or pagoda barn. Somebody called it a pagoda barn, I think.
That's how I've heard it referred to as well.
Yeah, again, that's that era when you had a lot of this experimentation with round barns. The Manchester barn up in Auglaize County. You have an early phase of multi-sided barns in Ohio, whether octagon or hexagon, and then you have the true round barns, are more early 20th century. The Manchester being the textbook example of it, and then that pagoda barn up in Henry County, I would almost call it one of those, it's like the Barberton barns, where you have this very wealthy, almost like a gentleman farmer that has a ton of money and starts building these extravagant, massive barns, and has deep pockets. You see a few of those around the state. but they're not what I would call mainstream barns. They're interesting, but I'm more interested in what the average farmer would be building and using. That's just my own personal preference.
Steve, as a student of vernacular architecture, in my mind, I think of the duck architecture, and that was early duck architecture. Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, at this time, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. So anybody who isn't able to use the chat, somebody who might be calling in, if you want to unmute yourself at this time and ask questions, we have a couple more minutes to do that.
I have a question that won't surprise you at all, but I'd like to hear your answer. And that's, do you think that there's another state that has as great or greater a variety of barn types than Ohio?
The only one I would say probably would be Pennsylvania. Maybe New York, but New York, a lot of people were leaving New York by the late 19th century and coming to other states like Ohio because the land was getting depleted and there was more land available here. So I don't know. I would say that Ohio and Pennsylvania probably would be a toss-up. You've traveled more than I have, Rudy, by far. So I'm not a big traveler. I'm more of a homebody.
Right.
People make fun of me, Rudy. I don't, all my friends go to these fancy places and stuff, and I go to, the little town down the road for eating out, the little burger joint. I get a big kick out of it.
Yeah. You get to talk to farmers too.
You got it.
Yep. No, I do think that we have the greatest variety of the states that I've been to. I think that the way migration patterns worked, both the first and second, I think that Ohio was kind of a focal point for people moving west. And it was just so fertile and so beautiful here that I think more people from different backgrounds settled here than any other state in the union. And I may be wrong, but that's just my gut feeling.
I have always admired your gut, Rudy.
Well, you should say.
Yeah. Hope you didn't hear Laura's comment.
Any comments?
I couldn't let that one
Any
pass.
comments on Louis Bromfield's barn?
Well, Rudy helped build that. He supervised it.
We don't know the history like Steve does.
Yeah, which one though? The big barn or the working farm barn?
Well, the big farm barn and also the roadside stand, the spring house that they had as a roadside stand. I think both of those are very important and memorable monuments to Ohio agriculture.
I agree. And as Steve said, we, after that horrible event where the big barn burned down, we were the ones that actually built the timber frame for that and had the Timber Framers Guild come in and assist in raising it. And from memory, I believe we had close to 50,000 people came out and watched us raise that barn, which I think was an important thing for people to realize, that often you hear that the art of building barns that last for centuries is lost. It's not lost, it's just not as common as it used to be. And I think a lot of people understood that when they saw that happen and they saw those qualified tradespeople that were able to do that. I think that barn, for me anyways, was the beginning of realizing how much information was in the buildings rather than any books that you could find. And so that led me to realize that more research by actually going into barns and seeing how the builder built it was going to be an important part of learning how to keep those barns alive. Because if you don't understand how they were built, you don't know how to take care of them. And I think the Malabar barn was really what made me aware of that. As far as the spring house goes, we actually worked with prisoners from the Mansfield Reformatory, and rebuilt that spring house several years ago. And you want to see some guys smiling from the beginning of the workday to the end work with some people that have been in the reformatory and get to come out and work outside. That was a great experience. But I think that was one of Louis Bromfield's genius ideas, was being able to market all of those fruits and vegetables by having people know that they were going to meet somebody from Hollywood when they came to buy their watermelon. And I think that was a wonderful business move on his part.
Rudy, what's the status of the
Thank you.
working barn? Has a major minor roof system, doesn't it, in it?
Yes, it does. And the reconstruction that we did on it seems to be holding up really well.
That's where we did a workshop for the sugar shack.
Yeah, we just last year did a workshop for a new sugar shack for Malabar. So when they do their spring maple syrup festival, they have somewhere for the naturalists to actually work inside of and show people how this all is done. But the working farm barn is in very good, useful condition, and it is being used on a regular basis now. So it's looking into its second century, maybe third if we're lucky.
I hope so. Just a quick memory from Malabar. After my father died in 1993, I drove my mom up. I said, let's go up to the Inn at Honey Run at Christmas and have it there. And we stopped at Malabar and it was snowing. And I said, we need to go to the top of Mount G's. And she says, you think I can walk that? I said, yeah, I think you can if you hold my arm. So we parked the car at the gate. We walked, opened the gate, closed it, and walked up to the top, and that view with the snow and the pine trees and Mohican in the distance. It's a memory that she just loved, and it took her mind off Dad. She just loved it. Loved that place.
Well, Steve, there are several comments of people thanking you for tonight's presentation. I would also like to extend a big thank you on behalf of everyone who's attended this evening for your time, again, and all of your researchers. It was a wonderful presentation. Also, on behalf of Friends of Ohio Barns, I would like to thank all of our attendees for joining us this evening, and for many of you for joining over 4 lectures this spring. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I know I've learned a lot. Just a few reminders before we part this evening. Again, if you're not too familiar with Friends of Ohio Barns, we hope that you'll visit our website, friendsofohiobarns.org. You can get a hold of us through the website as well. You have access to the lectures, all 4 of them, via YouTube, and you can get the links through our website. And finally, if you're not already a member of FOB, we would love to have you as a member, and we hope to see many of you in person in 2022 in Preble County. With that, I'm going to say good night. Again, thank you to Steve Gordon and to all of our guest lecturers this spring. It's been great fun. And I hope you all take care, stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you in 2022.
Thanks, Steve. Great presentation.
Thank you, Steve.
Really nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're a great group. Wonderful to see all of you.
You too.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Steve, so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hey, good job, Steve-O. Good to see you, my friend.
Likewise. All right. We'll talk to you soon, Bill. Take care.